In summer of 2008, I had the remarkable privilege of getting to spend a couple of months camped out on Navajo land, hosted by a couple of host families, together with groups of Jewish teenagers who were there to do service work, Habitat for Humanity style work, and to learn from another desert-based diaspora people about holding on to identity in a complex and changing world. It was a remarkable experience that I continue to draw from on the regular. Our final host on Navajo is a man named Earl, his wife Sadie. He was a shepherd, still is, presumably, up in the mountains in northern New Mexico. And during our couple of weeks living on Earl and Sadie's property, I came to be familiar with what I thought of as the two fires: the fire by day and the fire by night. The fire by day came from this gigantic outdoor camping stove hooked up to a massive tank of propane that produced the biggest and scariest flame I have ever seen and could bring a big pot of water, good for feeding 15 hungry teenagers, to a seething boil in seemingly matter of seconds. We referred to it as the blaster, and when the time came to light it, I always made sure I was somewhere else. That was the flame that provided our meals during that time. That was the flame that made possible our experience in this remote and beautiful place. At night, Earl would build for us a campfire. And by some remarkable native wisdom, I have never seen anybody build a campfire like this. He, in my mind, laid just a couple of logs. I don't know what he did, but it was the biggest, most beautiful fire I have ever seen. And it burned seemingly untended for hours and hours until late in the night. And I would sit there after the kids had gone to their tents, and I would just watch this fire and watch the sparks rising up to meet the stars in the sky. We didn't cook on that fire. We didn't camp near that fire. It wasn't there for warmth. It was simply there to make us feel at home. It was simply there to be beautiful. There was the fire by day that was the fire of use. And there was the fire by night, which was the fire of beauty. We have two kinds of ritual fire that we use in our tradition: Shabbat candles and Hanukkah candles. Shabbat candles, many people are surprised and maybe even a little disheartened to find out, are not meant to be a spiritual tool. They are for many of us today, and some of the most beautiful spiritual moments that I have been lighting the Shabbat candles or bearing witness to people lighting the Shabbat candles. But Shabbat candles were created with a purely functional purpose in mind. You can't tend the fire on Shabbat, and you don't want to eat your dinner in the dark. So you light your candles before Shabbat begins. You sit around your table and eat by their light. And when the candles go out, it's time for the guests to go home and to go to bed. Shabbat candles were created to serve a purely functional purpose. Their aesthetic and spiritual value is secondary. Hanukkah candles, on the other hand, are explicitly like the fire by night that burned each night on Earl and Sadie's property high up in the mountains. I passed you around the text just to make sure. This text comes from the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. It is prohibited to utilize the Hanukkah lights, even to examine items or count coins by their illumination. Even a holy purpose is prohibited, such as studying Torah by their illumination. You're not allowed to use the Hanukkah lights for any purpose, mundane or religious. You're not allowed to use them to light your table to eat by. You're not allowed to use them to light your desk to count up your money by. You're not even allowed to set them on the table and sit and study Torah by their light. The Hanukkah candles are explicitly not for any purpose other than to be beautiful reminders that we once bore witness to miracles and that miracles continue for us today. They serve no other function other than to speak to our hearts and to our souls. In a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Brura, it lays it out. It's prohibited to utilize the Hanukkah light in order to make clear that it is light for the sake of a mitzvah, the mitzvah of publicizing the miracle. And also because the miracle that took place involved the temple's great menorah. And the menorah, too, the menorah's light, was not to be used for any purpose at all. The same distinction between the blaster and the campfire, between the Shabbat lights and the Hanukkah lights, also existed in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. Where one fire burned constantly, that was the fire of sacrifice. There to take animals and crops and to turn them into smoke to send them up to God. That was a fire of use. But in addition, there burned a menorah, a ner tamid, a perpetual light in the temple, which served no other function but to remind the people of God's eternal loving presence in the space. The menorah, the ner tamid, is the one remnant of the ancient temple that we still all have in our modern synagogues. Over the ark burns a light which is never to go out. Not there to illuminate the room, but there to illuminate in some way our heart and soul, to remind ourselves that God is here in this space with us. And so I want to think for just another couple of minutes about this distinction between those things which are of use and those things whose use is purely for uplift, for appreciation, and for the stirring of gratitude in our souls. Martin Buber, the 20th century Jewish philosopher, wrote a skinny volume of philosophy in 1923 called I and Thou. I and Thou is a complex philosophical book written in fancy philosophical German that boils down to an idea that I can explain while standing on one foot. It's really quite simple. Martin Buber said that we are always relating into the world in one of two ways, I-it and I-thou. In I-it mode, we relate to one another in relationships of use. I visit the bank and encounter the teller, and I get my money, and they continue to have their job. I visit the restaurant, and I see the waiter. They bring my food. I leave them a tip. We engage in relationships of use, not just with anonymous people who serve us, but with our closest and nearest and dearest all the time. How many times have we asked a partner if they can stop on the way home at the supermarket to pick up a quart of ice cream? Or ask somebody else if they could pick up the remote, which is sitting just outside of our arm's distance? That is a relationship of use. Would you be my arm extension, please? I don't want to move. I'm comfortable. We engage, Buber said, for the majority of our life in relationships of use because we have to get things done. And there's no shame in that. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing inherently exploitative, Buber says, about I-it. But if the quantity of our life is in I-it, Buber says, the quality of our life is to be found in the other mode of relationship, which he called I-thou. In the I-thou mode, We want nothing from the other person except the gift of their presence. I want nothing from you but you. You don't serve a functional purpose for me, but you make my life so very much better by just being here, maybe holding my hand, maybe sitting in silence or in deep conversation, maybe sitting together in a circle and making music together. The quantity of our life will always be in it, will always be in relationships of use, but the quality of our life will always boil down to the capacity to cultivate moments of thou. Moments when we are with each other, not needing anything from each other, except the simple gift of the other's presence. Hanukkah candles are thou candles. They are the candles that remind us that life can't just be about how can we use one another, or how, importantly also, are we to be of use. We live in a culture addicted to it. So much of our cultural, our national, our ecological crisis comes down to treating each other, treating our economic systems, and treating our globe as a great toy box of which we can be spoiled children and use and use and use without regard to the cost. So much of the crisis of our mental health has to do with internalizing the idea that we are only valuable to the extent that we are of use. That our value in the world is directly linked to our KPIs, to our outputs, to how much money we have in our wallet, how many items we have on our resume, how much work we can do, and forgetting all too often that we are measured not just by what we do, but by what we are, and even more importantly, what we are for each other. Shabbat candles are about use, but Shabbat itself is also thou time. It's one day out of the week in which we don't seek to use the world, in which we don't justify our existence or value ourselves based on our outputs, but we are allowed to be beautiful and shining, just as we are. In these last nights of Hanukkah and every Shabbat that we gather, I want to invite us to appreciate the miracle of those things in life which are not for use, those things in life that are beyond use, those things in life that are beautiful and perfect just as they are, those things that give us inspiration, give us strength, give us meaning, just by their very presence. May we appreciate those things in our world. May we be those things for each other. Shabbat Shalom, Hag Sameach.